All right, I think we are now live. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today on this Thursday afternoon. We chose this time slot because we do have a global audience that have signed up, and just to sort of spread the love a bit, who knows, maybe next time I'll be presenting in the middle of the night here to get some of our friends over in North America. So my name's Anthony Cook. I'm the product manager for Supervisor. And with me today is Oscar Rondon. He's our principal geostatistician that we have in-house for all the tricky questions which I bring to him when we're creating things for Supervisor. So just some things before we get started. There is a chat box which you can utilize in the chat window there. There's options within that chat window when you send a message that you can send a question to the staff. And that way we can just capture questions as we go along. Oscar will be looking at the chat window, and we can then address those at the end of the session during a bit of question time there. So before we get started, just some acknowledgements. So we have had the privilege of generating some amazing stuff with the Supervisor tools, which we'll be able to show you today. And we would like to thank all of the clients that we've worked with, which have allowed us to display those results in an anonymous format and just allowing us to work with them. It's been a pleasure. We'd also like to thank all of the users which have participated in our beta release programs, which have made it possible for us to release 8.14. All of your feedback has been incredibly invaluable, and we look forward to working with you further in the future as well. So obviously we've done a little bit of introduction already. If you have any questions, we're more than happy to answer them and address them. And as we go through our presentation today, we'll be looking at firstly what's new in 8.14, just a brief overview. We'll have a bit of a discussion about the challenges with simulation that we've been targeting with this new component that we've got. And so there might be a little freebie of a statistics lesson in there for you if you're not familiar with some of the processes that we've got. But we'll keep that very brief, very high level, and then we'll look at how we've gone about solving those problems in the new components that we'll show to you today in a live demo before we finally head into a bit of Q&A. So without any further ado, Oscar, is there anything you would like to add?
That's okay. Yeah. I'm going to switch the camera off now, Anthony, and turn it back on for the questions.
All right, fantastic. Right, so Supervisor, we've had quite a few releases over the past year. We've really started amping up our efforts to provide some really new and innovative solutions and to provide all of our users with just the best quality tools that they can use throughout their geostatistical processes. So just looking back a couple of releases, we've got the top cut analysis tool, got some great things there that we've even improved upon, which I'll show you in just a second. And then leading into our conditional simulation, a huge one which has been anticipated for a while, and we've seen some great things done with that already. And the one we're most excited to bring to you today is, of course, the multivariate simulation. And just the challenges that we're able to overcome through using a process like this is just fantastic. Through my consulting, I've had to deal with some of these without the aid of software like what we've put into Supervisor, and it really is a challenge. So it's just a pleasure to be able to work with a software that can provide solutions that are just practical solutions to those problems. So of course, number one, the most exciting tool we have is the multivariate simulation. Sorry, this is not the right one. Let's skip on. The global top cut analysis, this is what I wanted to talk about first. The indicator lines, we have narrowed those up. We've had a few requests working with our clients in getting just a bit more visibility on that graph. We've looked at all the little ways that we can take this tool and just make it so much more of a pleasure to work with. And that includes looking at the output of this table and just getting that into a format that really anyone can understand. It's something that we come back to, particularly in our training, to really provide a bit of knowledge on how to use these softwares to get the best results for your skewed data sets. And this is just a great tool for the practitioners which utilize this on a daily basis. Another one which has been hotly requested is being able to provide multiple grade tonnage curves on a single plot. So previously you might have to do this in several runs, and we took one of the tools that we had for one of our other components and really just thought, why not just put it onto this one as well. So you can go ahead, put in all the various block sizes you want, see the differences in the predicted grade tonnage curves based on certain reblockings or certain SMUs, and then go right ahead and export all of those results for further analysis or to check against your results once you get the model out the other end. So that's just a couple of the niceties that we've got there. We take all sorts of suggestions from our users and we continually work on those. We've even got a few in the pipeline which I'm afraid I can't share with you currently, but also quite excited to bring to you. On top of that, we just focus on any of those little changes and fixes, number of bug fixes, always making sure that our processes are as stable as possible. And thank you to everyone that provides feedback on those, as well as just enhancing the components that we have. So some of the more obvious ones, like applying some additional filtering in the conditional simulation tools, as well as being able to take those theoretical grade tonnage curves that we are using to validate our results and putting them directly across each of our components. So you can look forward to using those. Now, one thing that we do want to talk about today is conditional simulations in general. Now, there's a lot of uses for conditional simulations, usually in the area of economic cutoff, probability studies, risk analyses, and it's not always just grade that you will go about simulating, but it's one of the more common. Now, I say that univariate methods are straightforward, and sure, once you get into them, they are fairly straightforward, but things really start to get a bit murky when we talk about our multivariate data sets. So this is where we start having to take into consideration the composition of our materials, the composition of the rocks, and really looking at the typically complex and nonlinear correlations that we have to deal with on a daily basis and really in validating those simulation results. And so if you do that in the univariate space, you can run into a few problems. And I'm going to be referring to compositions and correlations a fair bit throughout this presentation. And so I just wanted to touch on, just for those which might not be too familiar, what compositional data is. So this is extremely important, especially when you've got two variables which make up the bulk of your material, your rock, whatever it might be, and you need to maintain the correlations between them. So if we consider we've got somewhere between 0 and 100% of each of these two variables, we should typically see our points fall within that lower half of the plot underneath that variable 1 plus 2 is 100% line. You know, if we consider that any of those points is some sort of rock, it shouldn't be possible for us to get a result which is over 100% rock. It's just not possible. So typically when we look at this in some form of real data, we might end up with some very complex correlations like you see here, but still they maintain that restriction that they have to be within 100%. Now, when we deal with that, it's not so much a problem when we deal with our normal linear estimations. We rely on some of the implicit correlations, and we can control our estimation parameters to ensure that we always use the same samples in our estimations and that the implicit correlations between those samples will come out in the wash, so to say. Now, this isn't so much the case in simulation. There's a couple of random variable processes which occur during a standard conditional simulation, and that causes all sorts of havoc if we don't manage those throughout the process. So while each individual simulation will be valid and an equiprobable realization of the deposit, once we start comparing them, we run into a few problems, the worst of which we can see in the top graph there. Immediately we can see that we're getting results that are coming back saying that for this composition we have over 100%, and all of those problems just are prolific throughout the deposit, and there's just no way that we can consider the probabilities of both at the same time. Now, the methods that we've put into our supervisor software allow us to do what's called some multivariate Gaussian transformations, and that allows us to maintain the correlations while we do these on their own simulations on independent factors, they're called. But there's no need to get into the nitty-gritty. Oscar did a full webinar on this previously, so we'll just focus on just a bit of an understanding to give you a very broad overview. So behind the scenes, we're doing what's called the Gaussian factors, multivariate simulation, and essentially we take the input data, we Gaussianize those into 2 independent factors or more, however many you might need. We then do the simulation in that independent space and then back transform the results to ensure that they match those inputs. Again, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty. Oscar does provide all sorts of training on that, which I'm sure he would be happy to talk about later. Now, in order to do that, there's a few ways in industry. Some of them are more applicable than others. One that might be most commonly known in the audience today is the PPMT method. So that's short for the projection pursuit multivariate transformation method. And that's a fairly classical technique. There's quite a lot of study done on that one. It's fairly well known in the research space, but it does run into a few problems once you start to get fairly large data sets, and we'll be able to see some of the issues in that in just a little bit. Now, Snowden, with the great work that Oscar's done, we've come up with a method that we've borrowed from across industry called the GPCA, or the Gaussianization using principal component analysis. Now, this is more flexible than any of the standard principal component analysis methods that you might have used previously. And most importantly, not only does it run faster than PPMT, making it a more practical solution, but it also ends up with some much more robust results. Doesn't happen often, but you end up, in this case, with this process, a win-win. So let's have a bit more look at that. I always like to say that Supervisor, well, it has the catchphrase designed by geologists for geologists. And what that means is that we are providing practical solutions in a practical environment. So it's not just about using something as obscure as flow anamorphosis, which can take up to 8 hours to run for a single set of data. We're dedicated to offering these practical solutions that you can use in the mine environment. So one thing that we notice as we go into the future is that we now have access to so many more opportunities to analyze our data. Our understanding of our ore bodies is becoming more and more complex. And yet at the same time, we typically are afforded less time to actually do that analysis. There's always the assumption that your computers are much faster, therefore you must work much faster. And because of that, we need our computers to work for us wherever possible. One of the quotes that I never seem to get away from and see time and time again on all mine sites is that there's never enough time to do it right, but the amount of rework that you see on mine sites is just ridiculous. And it always seems like there's enough time to do it over. So at Snowden, we try and provide solutions which give you enough time to do it right. So the GPCA method, here we have a bit of a comparison with PPMT for just a fairly typical data set. And the first thing we notice is that on this particular test, what we're aiming to get to is full Gaussianization at the p-value of 1, and the GPCA is just several iterations quicker than the PPMT. And that's what we call converging to that multivariate state. Another way that we can visualize this is to actually look at the scatter plot of the results as they iterate across those. And one of the most important things I want you to take note of is that in the slide that I'm about to show you, GPCA and PPMT are both iterating at the same time. But one thing you might notice is that occasionally PPMT looks like it's doing nothing. Now, that's because in some of these iterations, the projection, and GPCA is pretty much there already, the projection pursuit method is actually going through almost a negligible change in its projection or its iteration. So while GPCA is just happily churning away, PPMT is finally getting to a result that we would be comfortable with. In addition, once we start looking at those massive data sets, we can see an incredible improvement on time with GPCA compared to our standard techniques like PPMT. And we're looking in the order of 1/10 of the time it would take otherwise. And this is just extrapolated as you add more and more data. I think the largest data set I've got there currently is 50,000 samples, which is a fairly reasonable data set, but by no means the largest data set that I've had to work with. So just any time we are looking at saving time is just going to add up, especially when you have an exponential increase like we have here. In some of the other tests that we did while looking and benchmarking these processes, I think some of the benchmarking that I got for GPCA couldn't even be reproduced in PPMT because it just took far too long to run and I needed to use my computer for other things. One of the other reasons that we even started looking into GPCA is that it tends to be a bit more robust on those particularly stubborn data sets. So quite often you'll see some stuff in a presentation just like this one where we'll show you all of these beautiful graphs and diagrams. And in fact, the biggest question is always, but will that work for my data set? Because you've all seen it, you've gone to that demonstration and it just hasn't gotten a great result. Well, this data set was probably one of the most stubborn that I had to work with. And just seeing the result that we got with GPCA was just so comforting after working so long to try and get to a reasonable result that we were happy working with, that pretty much sold it in my book on the spot. In addition, we've used this thing for all sorts of different data sets. So in particular, here's a couple, just a quick matrix of some correlations. We did all of these in the same time with the same transformation. And you can see immediately that the result in the simulation is just fantastic. I don't think we could have been asking for a better result in this case. And just seeing how it comes out and seeing the reproduction of all of those features which we have in our data set just gave us that confidence in the result that we could then go and use it for the study that we had in mind. So enough about that. How have we implemented it in Supervisor? So as always, we try to make it as simple as possible, and I'll show you this in practice in just a minute in the demonstration. But we get straight into it. We just add the component. As always, right-click on the domain, add the multivariate simulation. Supervisor will then check the project, it'll see what's available, and it'll add any of the necessary components as we work so that the users only need to make a few choices and we deal with all of the manual handling. And that is probably the most important thing. When I did this as a consulting job, I had to use about 4 different softwares. I was converting between various different data types. I was manually breaking apart tables and putting them back together and double checking that all of my rows lined up and I didn't accidentally put in quotes where I shouldn't have put in quotes. So just having something to take care of that for you would just save so much time and prevent all the amount of rework that comes with getting to the end and then realizing that there's a problem just with the manual handling of that data. Once we add it, we immediately are presented with all sorts of transformations that we can do on our data sets. I won't go into them on this video. I do have a YouTube video which has a bit of an example of me going through this process live as well. But we'll keep it brief during this webinar. And what we have available, particularly for the compositional transformations, if you have compositional data, we've got 3 different transformations depending on the data that you need. Typically, if you're not sure, just go with ALR. It should work for any grade distributions that you've got. Shouldn't be too much of a problem, but that could be something for you to investigate to give yourself a bit more knowledge on how those work. Then we have the multivariate transformations. So we've either got the PPMT or the GPCA, as I mentioned. As you can see, there's quite a few options for PPMT. I always stick to GPCA. You don't have to worry about anything. Supervisor will take care of it. Stick to 30 iterations. You won't have to worry about anything. Once we have done that transformation, Supervisor will have your factors all ready for you. You'll be able to do a bit of a validation, and then all you need to do is define your simulation parameters. Now, these should be very familiar from the Conditional Simulation suite. Again, I won't go into detail on these. It's all in our how-to videos. And once we have those, we'll be able to do the variography. It's automatically added, so you just need to go to it and update it. And then once you've completed everything and you're ready to go, you hit go and it does all the crunching in the background for you. Once it's done, it'll give you the block size which you requested, all reblocked. You'll have the point data there if you need it. You'll have that reblocked data set, and it'll go ahead and add a few validation components that we've put together specifically for the multivariate simulation and form the base of validation components. And we've got a few more to come in some of our upcoming releases, but I think that it provides a nice, good start for anyone that just wants to have a look and check and validate that the results that they got are reasonable and match the input data. Once you have that data, once you have those simulations, it's up to you what you want to do with it. You can go ahead, export those tables, they're already there for you, and do whatever process it is that you might need to do with those simulations. So, that said, let's have a look. I'll swap over to my data set, and hopefully that's come up. Oscar, can you see my Supervisor software?
Yeah, it's looking good. I can see it.
Thanks. And I might just turn off my webcam for this so that we get a bit more of a full screen so you can see what's going on. Now, what I've got here, I've got a data set that we've had the privilege to be able to use, and I've just got it sorted out so that I've already loaded it in. I've loaded it as domain over assay. Again, it's just in there fresh, and we're pretty much ready to go. We can have a bit of a look at the data set and see what it looks like in 3D. It's a nice simple data set just to give you an idea of how things work. It's pretty much a 2D data set, just about. And you can see that we've got some iron grades, more or less high grades across the top, low grades along the bottom. We've got some silica grades, which, as you would expect, are basically the opposite. We can have a quick look at the correlations between some of these to get a bit of an idea of what we're going to be attempting to reproduce in our multivariate simulations. Again, if we were to follow standard univariate practices, we're going to end up with a scatter of points which essentially fill this entire scatter plot, which is just going to be no good for us to do our work on. So, adding the component, very straightforward. We simply add the multivariate simulation, and immediately we're presented with the screen on the transformation page saying which assays would you like to use and what transformations would you like to go for. So in this case, I'll use all of my assays. Again, it's very easy just to choose which ones you want to check on and off. And it is compositional data, so I do know that each of these is in percentiles, so we are expecting to get to 100%. I also know that adding all 4 of these up is not going to give me 100%, so I need to use what's called a filler, which is essentially the everything else. And if we don't use that, we can run into some problems, but it's right there ready to be used. I'm also going to use GPCA. Again, it's my favorite and very, very straightforward. And essentially, it's just a lot quicker too. It's really as simple as that. Once we're ready, we hit transform. Supervisor does a bit of thinking in the background and puts out our results. It's added in the compositional transformations as a table. So here we've got all of our variables in the ALR space, and immediately it went straight ahead and then transformed those ALR variables to the independent Gaussian factors. One neat little thing that we've added here are some custom scatter plots. So these are pretty cool. I thought it was a nice little touch that Oscar suggested. And essentially this is just a really nice way. We've just got 400 data points, so it's a bit more difficult to see, but it's a really easy way of seeing how well that Gaussianization has performed. And coming up in our next update, we'll even put some more stats on this so you can see immediately, but it's just as easy. You can type onto here, I want to see everything within the 95th percentile, and we can see that this is a pretty good result. Again, Supervisor has already added our independent factors. Doing variography on this is just as easy as it is for any of our other variables which we might have added. Just going through the process. I would love to show everyone the variography because it is my favorite, but I won't waste your time. That said, let's swap over to one I prepared earlier in number 2. So in this case, again, just as we saw, I've just already prepared some of the variography for you, just so that we can see what we go with it. So again, back to the multivariate simulation. So here I'll be defining the space in which I'm going to do my estimation. So one thing that I might want to do in particular for this data set, I can see that my area that I'll be simulating into, I can just quickly flick that on here, is this space here. So Supervisor finds the area in which you need to simulate into, or what the extents of the data are. And I'm not too interested in simulating all the way out here. It's going to really affect my results because there's just no data out there. And looking at the scale, I feel that I could probably restrict to within 10 meters of the samples. And the easiest way to do that is to just pop in a 10 in this node sample distance here. So, like I mentioned, just from the specified region, I'll do 10 simulations. Block size of 2 should be fine. And looking at our variography, so the variography is automatically matched up to each of the factors. And I'm just going to stick with the defaults here. Again, not too concerned, this is just for demonstration purposes. And I believe we are ready to hit go. So Supervisor is going to go through, it's going to perform simulations on each of those factors. It's going to be breaking them apart, putting them back together. It's going to be generating 10 independent realizations in the multivariate space as we requested in the simulation tab. And there is a bit of smarts that we put into Supervisor so that if you have 10 variables and you want 100 realizations, you're not going to be sitting there waiting for 1,000 simulations to run. There is a bit of smarts in the background, which we can cover at another segue. But as far as this goes, you can see that my simulation is complete. So what have we generated? Well, first of all, we've generated the simulation sets that I need to do. So Supervisor will generate these all together. Again, we can see in our scatter plots how well these might have performed. And again, we can have a look and just look for ourselves to see that, yes, we have simulated in Gaussian space and they look like they are still independent. We haven't accidentally introduced correlations which are going to cause us issues down the line. So fantastic. Again, all the stats are there for you to check and look at as required. The second one, not as useful for us to look at, but the results are there for the compositional space. And then finally, the back transform to raw space. So here we actually have our gridded data, so at the point scale, and we can have a bit of a look at, say, iron in percentiles, and we can start to get an idea of how that might look at the very fine point scale. But what we're most interested in, of course, is the actual simulation itself. So let's have a quick look. And we can start to see exactly what we saw in the inputs. We can see the high grades along the top, and we can see the low grades that are majorly down the bottom there too, as well as the influence of the simulation. So we get a bit of that randomness. We're not over smoothing it, and we're starting to get a view of our deposit on the probabilistic point of view. Now, if you don't believe me that this is a reproduction of the input data, we can check that. And immediately, so we've set up this brand new model validation tool specifically for our multivariate data sets. It's a streamlined version of our model validation where we already know the model that we need to check. We already know the point data because it's in the same tree, and we can effectively just compare any of the assays with any of the simulations, and even against different assays if that's something that you're interested in, just in case. So we can see that in simulation 1, we get a pretty reasonable reproduction of the mean. We get a great reproduction of the distribution. I think silica is also a nice one that we should be checking. So let's just do a quick update on that. I should select all of these. And all of these are fully featured just as you have in the rest of your model validation components. We can change the slicing. We can check our 3D viewer to see what those slicing spacings look like to get a bit of an idea, just in case we have any queries with that. And again, we're really looking at seeing how well we're reproducing that data set. Are we getting any over smoothing that we wouldn't expect? We can compare the means, and effectively everything that you might need to check that data should be available to you, at least for the model validation purpose here. In addition, of course, when we're interested in simulations, we're very interested in our grade tonnage curves. So again, this is a specific grade tonnage curve just for our multivariate simulation. And in that, we define a primary attribute which we're going to compare the rest of our attributes against. So I'm going to select iron. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty with defining all the cutoffs, so I'm just going to go with the defaults here. And what it's going to do is it is going to provide me with the cutoffs for the tonnage, iron, alumina, silica, manganese, all for the iron cutoffs. So this is a great way of seeing what the content in your deposit is for your various other elements based on the cutoffs that might be your economic driver. So we can see the tons based on the iron cutoff, iron based on iron, all the others as well. And then we can start to make some interesting views, this one in particular. So on this chart, we also provide the percentiles, and very interestingly in this one, we actually get a bit of a segregation where the simulations tend to avoid the mean value. We seem to be getting some extremes. So we can look into that and we can then dig down deeper and see if that's important and of value to us. Again, all of the results are available for us. We can copy those, export those. There's results tables everywhere that you might expect to see them. And just like all of our other components, they're fully featured with everything that you've seen so far. Again, like I mentioned, all of the simulations are here. This table at the top level can then be exported, and you can convert that into the format of your GMP of choice, so your mining programs of choice, and utilize that in your 3D visualization software and your optimizations for comparing against your risk analysis. And really, I don't want to give you or tell you what to use this tool for, because I feel like that really would railroad the potential for this tool. It could be so broad. But I think that's everything I've got to show you in here. Like I was saying, it's just such a straightforward process. I really don't see how we could make it too much simpler, but that said, I am completely open to suggestions at all time. So Thank you for that. Let's swap back to the slides. So like I said, the practical applications, I don't want to prescribe what to do with these. There's so many potentials. Any multivariate deposit is just made for this tool. Even grade control modeling is, you can generate a viable grade control model that's risk-based as opposed to optimization-based, or whatever you might want to call your geostatistical ordinary creed estimate based on geostats principles. There's obviously applications of anything which has correlated data, whether that's metallurgical, and even those which are non-compositional. So we've already heard from some users that they have some plans for this tool in some uncertainty modeling. And one thing that I hadn't heard of before is the multiple uncertainty modeling. So we're really keen to see how this tool is used. We'd be really keen to do some case studies on just how broad we can utilize this tool. But just to give you a bit of an idea, one thing that we have used this on in practice is a drill hole spacing and optimization. And really the question that we were tackling in that is what drill spacing is sufficient for confidence in those estimates, and very importantly, is more or less investment warranted for various parts of the deposit compared to others? How do we optimize our drilling so that we're not over drilling areas that are very confident and under drilling areas with low confidence and just doubling up on our drilling when we could optimize that budgeting? So very practical applications in that space. So that is everything that I have. I'll turn my camera back on and hopefully Oscar will join me. I hope that hasn't gone too quickly. Just getting through all of the content there. I did want to leave a bit of time for questions just in case someone had any. We're happy to answer questions about the use of the software, the applications, any technical questions that you might have, anything that we're able to share with you, we would be happy to. And even any questions that you might have for myself regarding Supervisor in general, we absolutely would like you to take the opportunity, because this is a release webinar. It's not just a multivariate simulation webinar, for you to ask those questions so that we can be here to answer those and perhaps connect with you at a later date as well. So I see we do have one question. How can we import the block model tonnage grade curve into the point support object? Oscar, do you know what that's referring to?
Yeah, I guess I answered that. My understanding is that if you already compute the grade tonnage curve for a block model, then you want to compare that with the point support, the point support grade tonnage curve model in Supervisor. If my understanding is right, what I mentioned is it's not possible to do it in Supervisor at the moment, but we can do it on the model validation component. So you just import the model, report it there, and that's the way to go. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so yeah, we're more than happy to work with users that have requests just like that. If there is anything about those tools which would make it easier to validate, that's what we're here to find out. Now, my window is quite small. I'm just trying to.
Yeah, but I don't see many questions, but yeah, feel free to ask.
There's one here. How is it working on imported datamine block models with subcells? Most of the block models in datamine have subcells. I believe it's either this update or the next one that we've got coming that will completely honor all subcelling. Supervisor honors subcells as it is. I believe currently we produce a simulated node to the smallest subcell and then reblock up from that. But we are adding additional tools, particularly with those datamine block models, so that you can reproduce exactly that block model from the input to the output. So if what we have currently isn't quite there, it's coming extremely soon.
Yeah, we got another question here, Anthony. People are asking if the transformation works well with highly skewed data.
Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, the answer is yes. We all know we have to be really careful with highly skewed data. But remember, what we are doing in PPNT or GPCA, we are doing like a marginal anamorphosis. So it's a quantile transformation, which usually work fine with highly skewed data. We have to be careful, nonetheless, with detection limits. Yeah? So what is called the zero effect, we have to be careful with those, and that's the reason in Supervisor, we provide the ability to do the transformation and then check the factors. So you can see what you are getting well before running the simulation. Yep.
There's another question here. How to reduce the simulation to choose the best ones? It's a great question. As we know with simulations, there's no right or wrong simulations. All of them are equiprobable realizations of the data set that you imported, provided that you followed good techniques. That said, typically when we're looking at some of these studies, we do want to avoid some of the more extreme valid answers. And so to do so, we would look at things like those great tonnage curves, in which we would then look at, with a bit of a grain of salt, look at some of the ones which are really reaching the edges of those probabilities. So right up at the 95th and right down at the 5th percentile, we might be a bit more concerned about those ones. I don't think we have any particular tools which can go through and sort that out currently, but one of the export functions which we are producing will assist with getting an idea of where each of those simulations sit and with regards to that.
I guess there is, it's hard to see there. Well, there is another question there. Go for it.
I was just going to say, Oscar, there's a pop-out button there too. So another question, will the MVS work equally well for non-compositional data, such as gold and silver in an epithermal model? One thing I do like to say about this is that the transformation processes will output anything that is input. So any of your correlations which you have that you use as an input, you'll get as an output. If you put in two non-correlated data sets or non-compositional data sets, whatever non-correlation they have that goes in will be reproduced on the output. So while this works best for compositional data, just keep in mind that whatever you have that going in will come out.
Yeah, just another comment, Anthony. The compositional transformation is there to be able to use the multivariate simulation with compositional data. So if the data is not compositional, we don't need it. So the multivariate simulation works well if we have compositional or non-compositional data, not a problem.
Would the result of the simulation be the best result to be able to make my reserve estimate? I believe that's a question for your competent person.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, can you read the next one, Anthony? Sorry, what is the other one? So they say.
Yeah, sorry, just to, that might be a bit of a cop-out answer. There's no reason in geology that we can't create or sign off on models which are generated through simulation processes. It's not the norm, but as a competent person, if you follow correct practice and you can demonstrate that the result is a valid result, follows all of the requirements, then there's really no reason it couldn't be. But of course, it's in the hands of the competent person to ensure that the processes that they follow are appropriate for generating that estimate, and then sign off on it.
There is another one here, Anthony. Yeah,
yep.
Go for it.
So where can I find more detail about the mathematics behind your suggested algorithms? From the title, it includes PCA, but what more? There are other algorithms recently used for transformation, such as Gaussian process. Is your algorithm somehow related to the Gaussian process?
No, it's not. You are right. There are many transformations out there. I've been really surprised to see, for instance, how Google is using transformations. I mean, not with the idea that we have in mind for simulation, but you can find at least 10 or 12 different techniques. But this one here, we are looking, as Anthony mentioned, is something that is fast and reliable. So, and we found PPNT and GPCA are working fine so far. So we are well aware, for instance, of flow anamorphosis and Gaussian processes, but in practice, with real data, we found some of the technique really small, and we didn't have all the benefit we were looking for. So that's the reason so far we only have those two. Yeah, I got an interesting question here, Anthony. So can we co-simulate data with different units? For instance, ppm for gold and percentage for copper? Yep, remember that what we are doing here is we are taking the data, transform the data to Gaussian space, doing independent simulation in Gaussian space, and the back transformation look after the data. So when we back transform, we get back to raw data space. So it's not a problem.
And sorry, just one thing I'll add to Amir's question is that the details about everything that we've used in this process are in the help documentation. So we've got references to the papers which we've used in order to generate these processes.
Yeah.
There's another one for you, Oscar. So if we have non-compositional data, which has a strong correlation, the MVS will preserve the bivariate and multivariate correlations. Will it reproduce the covariograms?
For sure. We need to check the cross variogram, but that's the reason when we generate the factors, we check the correlation, which is the cross correlation that lacks 0, and then in Supervisor we can compute the cross variogram. If we don't have any correlation at distance 0 and any cross correlation, the simulation is going to preserve the spatial cross correlation. Yep.
Yep. Sorry, that was one thing that I left out of the demonstration, is just that anything that's produced by that process, you can treat it just like any other assay. So when you generate those factors, you can calculate the cross variograms and see that they are truly decorrelated, not just in their populations, but spatially as well.
Yeah. And looking at another question here is regarding if we can reproduce, if we can check the reproduction of the variogram in Supervisor. There is not a special component to grab the simulations, compute the variogram, and see that we check the variogram. We can do it, but there is not. So it's something that is coming. We are working on that. We got the feedback from many users to include that, but it's not ready yet in Supervisor.
Any other questions that we've got here? And just while we're waiting, I will click over to this. One thing we always try to make clear is that we always want to hear from you. Again, the tagline that we have for Supervisor is created by geologists, not geologist, not just myself or not just Oscar. It really is the users which drive the tools that we put into the software and the solutions that we provide. So please reach out to us. Again, if there's anything that you've seen today that you want more information about, we offer technical and software training. Oscar has a half-day course that he provides specifically on the multivariate simulation techniques, which will give you really that crash course into what's going on in this process for those that are really interested in adding it to their repertoire, as well as our advanced geostats course, which Oscar provides for really that next level of study. So we've got a bit of a philosophical question about conditional simulation is an interesting concept, and nevertheless, around the world, the majority of mining companies prefer to use estimation using kriging. From our point of view, what could be the reason for it? I honestly believe it's more of a tradition than a requirement at this stage. Kriging has been around for many, many years. It's tried and tested. There's really no need for people to move on from it. And it's really up to us to provide the accessibility to those new techniques, because I feel that kriging is very simple for people to get into and understand, and everyone uses it. Some of these techniques are much more difficult to get into. So providing tools like these within a software package like Supervisor means that more practitioners can use these. People can start using them earlier in their career, and we might even see some movement on that space because of it. And at the end of the day, it's these sort of tools and the accessibility to them which brings our entire cohort up with it. By making everyone able to digest these techniques a lot sooner in their careers means that we can then go ahead and develop the next big thing too. So, like I said, we are very keen to see these tools used in more spaces. If you're interested and don't yet have Supervisor and you want to see how it might work for you, please get in touch with your local data mine office. They provide local support for around the globe, and we can get in touch. Oscar and myself will, of course, be happy to come along to any demos to provide a bit of insight and discuss the techniques that we've made available. Again, I'm completely open to talking to clients with feedback and suggestions. My email's right there. Feel free to reach out to me there, and to the both of us on LinkedIn as well. Please do subscribe to our LinkedIn. Oh, Oscar's dog's awake. And check out our YouTube channel as well. We are trying to put more content onto there to help our users in using the full breadth of what Supervisor really has to offer. So I think if there's no other questions, I really want to again thank everyone for coming along to the webinar today, and I appreciate the time differences again. We'll be providing a recording of this webinar to anyone that couldn't attend, and really we look forward to seeing you at the next one. So thank you very much for attending. And on behalf of Oscar and the rest of the team.
Was my doggy. Sorry, guys.
Thank you very much, and
thank you.
Good evening, good morning,
and your questions.
Goodbye.